So picture a historical paradox that is just so baffling. It almost feels like a glitch in the matrix.
Oh, yeah. We are looking at the early Christian church today, and it is a wild ride.
Right, because for centuries, this is a group of people being violently persecuted. I mean, they're hiding in the shadows of the Roman Empire, literally fighting for survival.
Just enduring unimaginable marginalization and torture.
Exactly. And then, in this massive reversal of fortune, they essentially become the rulers of that very same empire. They have all the power, all the influence.
We're at the very top.
But fast forward a bit, and when Islamic conquerors eventually arrive at the gates of these Christian territories, the citizens don't mount a heroic defense.
No, they don't fight to the bitter end at all.
No, they just open the gates and willingly surrender without a single fight. In fact, they actually welcome them.
Which is just a complete inversion of what you'd expect from a society that had spent centuries just trying to exist, let alone finally rule.
It makes no sense on the surface. So today, in this deep dive, we're pulling from a really fascinating stack of sources. We've got historical lectures, academic papers, and some deep theological critiques.
All focusing on early church history, specifically the era right after the Edict of Milan.
Yeah, and our mission today for you listening is to figure out how on earth that paradox actually happened. We're going to examine the hidden mechanics of history.
Things you wouldn't necessarily think of.
Right, like how a freak weather event, a bunch of fleeing bureaucrats, and some deeply philosophical arguments about the afterlife completely redrew the map of the world.
To really grasp the magnitude of this shift, we have to ground ourselves in the timeline first. You mentioned the Edict of Milan earlier.
Right, which was, what, 313 AD?
Exactly, 313 AD. That's when Emperor Constantine basically legalizes Christianity. Suddenly, you aren't being thrown to the lions anymore.
Which is a nice upgrade.
Definitely. But the real pivot we're focusing on happens a bit later, around 390 AD.
Under the Emperor Theodosius.
Right. Under Theodosius, Christianity isn't just legal. It officially becomes the exclusive state religion of the entire Roman Empire.
So they've gone from the underground to the absolute top of the food chain.
Mm-hmm.
You would think this is the moment they just popped the champagne, right? The golden age begins.
You would think so, but from the lectures we reviewed, this newfound power actually triggers a massive fracturing split.
Yeah, the Roman Empire essentially divides into two completely distinct halves.
The East, which is heavily influenced by Hellenistic, Greek culture, and the West, which is dominated by Latin culture.
The unity they had when they were being persecuted just completely dissolved the moment they were in charge.
It really did.
Reading through this, it honestly reminded me of a massive corporate merger that just fails spectacularly because the two offices have totally incompatible company cultures.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Like you can put them under one logo, but if one office operates like a loose tech startup and the other acts like a rigid legacy bank, I mean, they are going to tear each other apart. Yeah.
And the sources point out that this wasn't just a political line drawn on a map. I mean, they were having fierce foundational disagreements about culture and doctrine.
Right, like this massive prolonged debates over whether statues and icons could even be used in the church.
Yeah, the Eastern Hellenistic mindset and the Western Latin mindset approach the very concept of worship in fundamentally different ways.
Because the icon debate, whether physical painted representations of the divine were acceptable, was really just a symptom of a much deeper cultural disconnect.
Exactly. They were essentially speaking completely different theological languages. And this internal friction severely weakened the internal cohesion of the empire.
Right, at the exact moment in history when it needed to be bulletproof.
Exactly.
But, I mean, cultural decay and theological debates over statues, they don't bring down a physical empire overnight, so they're tearing each other apart internally, sure.
Yeah.
But how did a literal invading army get through the most heavily guarded borders in the ancient world?
We are talking about the superpower of the era. Well, to understand the sheer shock of what happens next, you have to realize that for about 600 years, Rome experienced the Pax Romana, the Roman peace.
The capital was practically untouched by foreign invaders for 6 centuries.
It was considered completely untouchable, and a huge part of that invincibility was just pure geography. Rome's borders were secured by nature.
Right, to the south and east, you had these massive, punishing deserts.
And to the north, you had treacherous, churning rivers, like the Danube and the Rhine.
And across those rivers were the Germanic tribes, the so-called barbarians. But the Romans didn't even bother crossing the Rhine to conquer them.
No, they just looked across the water, saw vast forests and tribesmen, and deemed them too uncivilized to bother with.
They thought there was no wealth to extract, no infrastructure to take over, so, why spend the resources? They just used the rivers as a massive natural moat.
A moat that had worked flawlessly for generations. But then the climate itself turned against Rome.
This part is wild.
It wasn't some brilliant tactical military strategy that brought the barbarians across the border. It was just a freakishly cold winter.
Yeah.
The temperature dropped so severely for such a sustained period that the mighty Rhine River completely froze over. Solid ice.
Wait, I'm trying to picture the logistics of this.
Bruh.
The Rhine is massive.
Mm-hmm.
Are you saying the whole Roman army, the greatest military machine on earth, was just sitting on the banks watching these guys walk across the ice?
Pretty much.
Why didn't they stop them right there on the shoreline?
Well, the timing couldn't have been worse, and it really exposes the rot inside the Roman military machine at that time.
Okay, let's unpack this.
The borders were supposedly guarded by this massive army, hundreds of thousands of men, but by this point in history, those guards were largely mercenaries.
Ah, so the Romans had essentially outsourced their defense.
Exactly. Many of these soldiers were actually from the very same Germanic tribes they were supposed to be keeping out. They were wearing Roman armor, but they had no deep loyalty to Rome.
They were just there for a paycheck.
Right. And the people signing those paychecks, the emperors back in Rome, were completely distracted.
Yeah, the sources paint a picture of an administration obsessed with its own hedonism and internal political backstabbing.
They are living lavishly while the perimeter of their empire is quite literally freezing over.
So nature builds a bridge made of ice, and these barbarian tribes don't even need to build boats. They just pack up their families, their weapons, and literally walk across the river into Roman territory.
And that walk eventually leads to the unthinkable, the sack of Rome.
Wow.
When the capital is breached, when this eternal, supposedly untouchable city is looted and burned, the psychological shock to the ancient world is just unimaginable.
Suddenly, a civilization that thought it was divinely ordained realizes it's collapsing.
And immediately the finger-pointing begins.
The blame game here is fascinating because it's so intensely pragmatic. The pagans, the people who still followed the old Roman gods, instantly pointed at the Christians and blamed them.
And the sources highlight that this wasn't just some abstract religious grievance.
Right. When Christianity became the state religion, they didn't just quietly coexist. They actively dismantled the old religion. They smashed the statues. They closed the pagan temple.
But it's a complete systematic dismantling of a 1,000-year-old civic religion.
Which means it was a massive economic shock.
Yeah.
If you were a pagan priest or sculptor who made idols or, an architect who maintained the temple grounds, you didn't just lose your religion. You lost your job.
You lost your social standing, your entire livelihood.
So when the barbarians kick the doors in and the city is burning, these displaced pagans angrily claim that the old gods are furious.
They argue that Rome is being punished for abandoning the deities that kept it safe for 6 centuries.
Makes sense from their perspective.
Totally. So the church realizes very quickly that they have a massive public relations crisis on their hands.
Yeah, this accusation from the pagans was gaining serious traction.
Exactly. The church needed a robust intellectual defense to explain why a supposedly Christian Rome was currently on fire. So they turned to their greatest living mind.
A bishop in North Africa named Augustine.
Right. And his response wasn't just a quick pamphlet. Augustine was in his later years, and he dedicated over a decade of his life to writing this massive, famously complex and incredibly dense book called The City of God.
He spent 10 years writing just to answer the question, why is everything terrible right now?
Pretty much. And in trying to answer that question, Augustine essentially created the first Western philosophy of history.
Right.
He took Hellenistic philosophical concepts, ideas, heavily rooted in Greek thought, and blended them with Christian theology.
His core argument was that history is this macro-level battle between two cities. Right.
Yes. You have the earthly city, which is defined by the love of self, power, and greed. And you have the heavenly city, the city of God, defined by the love of God.
So he's projecting the chaos of the real world onto this grand cosmic struggle between good and evil.
Exactly. He argued that in this earthly realm, it might often look like evil is winning. I mean, Rome might fall, empires might crumble, bad people might triumph and loot your home.
Right.
But he assured the believers, none of that ultimately matters because good will definitively triumph at the very end of time.
The heavenly city is eternal. even if the earthly city you were standing in is currently burning to the ground.
Right.
But wait, isn't that a hopeful message for the listener? If your world is falling apart, isn't it comforting to know God wins in the end?
Well, this raises an important question, and it's exactly where our source material offers a really profound critique of Augustine.
Okay.
While his philosophy sounds deeply comforting, the sources argue that this Hellenistic view of history made the population incredibly passive.
Ah, I see.
It essentially told the common people, just endure the evils of this world, don't try to fix the broken systems, don't try to fight the injustice, just put your head down, suffer through it, and wait for your reward in heaven.
It acts like a cosmic anesthetic.
Yeah.
It numbs you to the pain of your current reality, but it completely stops you from actually treating the wound.
That is the perfect way to phrase it.
But wait, I'm trying to connect the dots here. A starving, illiterate farmer in the countryside isn't reading a 1,000-page, dense Latin philosophical text. How does Augustine's intellectual defense mechanism actually alter the behavior of an entire society?
It trickles down through the entire structure of the church. Augustine was the premier intellectual authority.
Right.
His writings shaped the minds of the bishops who instructed the priests, who delivered the sermons to those illiterate farmers every single week.
So the underlying message from the pulpit became one of endurance rather than resistance.
Exactly. The cultural mindset shifted from, we must build a better world, to, we must survive this world until the next one.
And the sources provide a really terrifying look at what just surviving meant in that era, specifically regarding these plunder wars.
Right.
Because war back then wasn't just two professional armies clashing on a battlefield. War was seasonal. It was tied directly to the agricultural cycle.
The barbarian raiders were highly strategic. I mean, they wouldn't attack in the spring when the fields were bare.
Right. They would wait until the farmers did all the backbreaking labor of planting and tending the crops.
Let someone else do the work.
Exactly. They waited until harvest time, and then they'd swoop in, slaughter anyone in their way, and just steal all the food.
If you lost your food, you starved to death. It's that simple.
And the sheer dread of this is hard to fathom. The sources describe how people were so desperate they had to build these massive, sheer fortresses on the tops of steep mountains.
Yes, just to survive.
They would farm down in the valleys, and the second the harvest was pulled from the ground, they would grab whatever they could carry, run up a steep mountain path, and hide in these stone forts, just praying they could survive the season.
And this reality is where the theological clash becomes a matter of life and death.
Yeah.
The source material argues that a true God, based on the original Hebrew covenant found in the Old Testament, would never tell people to just cower in a mountain fortress and passively wait for the afterlife.
Because the original Hebrew covenant demanded active, continuous participation in history.
Exactly. It demanded that believers fight real-world injustice. The goal wasn't to look for an escape hatch from the world. It was to end those plunder wars and create a fair, just society right in the present moment.
So, by adopting Augustine's Hellenistic view, the church essentially abandoned its mandate to fix the world.
Yeah.
They just spiritualized the suffering away.
Yes, they did.
But here's where it gets really interesting. While the common peasants are hiding in mountain forts waiting for the end of time, what is the church leadership actually doing?
Right, because the timeline moves forward.
By around 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire officially collapses. The Germanic tribes take over, and the Roman civil government completely evaporates.
It dissolves almost overnight. The Roman military governors flee.
Yeah.
But more importantly, the civil servants, the bureaucrats who actually kept the empire running, they abandon their posts.
These are the guys who collected the taxes, maintained the roads, managed the massive grain distributions, enforced the laws. They just pack up and run.
So the military governors are gone, the tax collectors are gone, the entire municipal framework of Rome disappears. But the church doesn't run.
The local bishop stays.
Exactly. The church is the only entity left standing that has a functioning nationwide administrative and organizational network.
Right.
They have bishops and priests in every major city and rural outpost. They have a clear hierarchy, a system of written communication, and a chain of command. For centuries, they had been inadvertently building a shadow government.
Which leads to this wild, almost cinematic moment highlighted in the sources. It's complete chaos. Rome is entirely vulnerable, and it isn't a Roman general who rides out to face the barbarian warlords.
No, it's a bishop, Pope Leo I.
He actually rides out to negotiate with these barbarian generals. He basically begs them, look, Take what you want, flex your power, but please limit your looting to just a few days so we can maintain some semblance of order.
And what's truly crucial to understand is why the barbarians actually listened to him.
It wasn't necessarily out of religious awe or fear of God, right?
Yeah, not at all. It was deeply practical. The barbarians had absolute military might. They had the raw physical power to conquer. But they had absolutely no idea how to actually run an empire.
This is the hardware versus software analogy from the sources, which I just thought was brilliant.
It really is.
Let's really unpack what that means. The barbarians were raiders and warriors. They had the swords, the hardware.
Right.
But they didn't know how to do municipal zoning. They didn't know how to calculate regional grain yields, or manage the engineering of an aqueduct, or run a complex multi-currency tax system.
They lacked the administrative skills, the literacy, and the organizational culture required to maintain the civilization they had just conquered.
Yeah.
They had taken over this vast, incredibly complex machine, but they didn't know how to write the code to make it run. So they had to rely on the only people who did.
The church leadership.
Exactly.
So the barbarians had the swords, but the church had the software. They had the operating system required to run a society.
Consequently, the church didn't just survive the fall of Rome. It ended up absorbing the administrative power of the state.
Wow.
Because the barbarian kings needed the bishops to run their territories, the church entrenched itself into the very fabric of governance. This is the precise mechanism that leads to the incredibly powerful, politically dominant papal system of the Middle Ages.
So how does that software permanently rewrite the hardware? How does a conquered people end up culturally dominating their conquerors so completely?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the sources go on this fascinating tangent about the nature of cultural power.
Yeah.
They actually compare historical cultural dominance to modern-day Hallyu, the Korean wave. Things like K-pop, BTS, and Korean dramas.
Yeah, I thought that was a great connection. Because while pop culture like music, food, entertainment is incredibly visible and highly exportable and popular, it isn't always the bedrock of true, lasting civilizational power.
Right. The kind of enduring power the ancient Greeks had, which allowed their culture to survive long after the political empire fell, comes from the humanities.
It comes from having a deep systemic worldview. Philosophy, complex literature, concepts of law and democracy.
Exactly. Because the Germanic barbarians lacked their own deep philosophical humanities. I mean, they didn't have their own Plato, their own Aristotle, or centuries of written legal precedent. They didn't have the cultural gravity to resist the church's worldview.
Right.
Couldn't just borrow the church's tax system without also absorbing the church's theology and culture. They were completely pulled into the church's orbit.
So by every earthly metric, the church won. They gained the ultimate political and cultural monopoly over the West.
They did.
But this brings us to what the sources frame as the ultimate betrayal.
Yeah, this is the tragic turn.
The church finally had the power they lacked when they were hiding in the catacombs. But what did they do with it? Did they use their massive political influence to end the seasonal plunder wars? Did they use it to create that just, equitable society that the original Hebrew covenant demanded?
According to the historical record, no, they didn't. The church diverted its newfound energy into massive political infighting. The bishops and popes engaged in endless power struggles with emperors and kings, entirely focused on maintaining, defending, and expanding their own authority and wealth.
They became the legacy bank they merged with.
Precisely. And in doing so, they completely ignored the suffering, the extreme poverty, and the daily misery of the common people.
Which is wild.
The very people they were supposed to shepherd were still starving, still being heavily taxed by the church-state apparatus, and still hiding in those mountain forts.
Which finally brings us full circle and reveals the answer to the mystery we posed at the very beginning of this deep dive.
Right, the arrival of Islam.
Exactly. When the Islamic forces eventually burst out of the Arabian Peninsula and arrived to conquer these territories, specifically sweeping through the East, the Levant, and North Africa, the Christian citizens didn't mount a defense.
They outright refused to fight for the church that ruled them.
Because Islam offered them a measurably better deal in the real world.
Yeah.
The Islamic conquerors arrived and offered vastly lower taxes and significantly less interference in their daily lives. The common Christian citizens were so beaten down, so exhausted by a bloated church government that taxed them heavily but did nothing to improve their physical security or living conditions, that they actually welcomed the Islamic armies.
They viewed the conquerors as liberators from their own oppressive religious leaders.
It is a stunning historical irony.
It really is. The institution that managed to survive the violent collapse of the Roman Empire by being the only organized administration left standing eventually lost its own people because it forgot how to care for them.
They mastered the mechanics of power, but they lost the mandate of the people.
Exactly.
So what does this all mean for you? We've covered a massive amount of historical ground here today. We've explored how an unprecedented drop in temperature bypassed the greatest military defense system of the ancient world. We've unpacked how Augustine's intellectual defense mechanism, telling everyone to focus on the afterlife, inadvertently created a passive society that allowed real-world injustice to thrive.
Right.
And we've seen how a church that successfully gained the whole world ended up losing its citizens because it failed to provide for them in the here and now.
It forces us to look at history not just as a timeline of dates, treaties, and battles, but as a series of choices about human welfare and responsibility.
Absolutely.
And drawing strictly from the source material's unique theological perspective, I want to leave everyone with a final thought to mull over. The sources view the Roman Empire, specifically post-Edict of Milan, as the Church's second Canaan, a promised land given to them by a sacred covenant.
But a covenant, by definition, is a two-way street.
It requires action. Because the Church focused exclusively on acquiring political power and told the poor and the suffering to just wait for heaven, that sacred covenant was fundamentally broken. The land was lost to Islamic conquerors because the basic responsibility to the people was ignored.
It really makes you look at the architecture of our modern world entirely differently.
It does.
The provocative question you have to ask yourself after examining this history is this. In our world today, when massive institutions, whether they are religious bodies, political parties, or even monolithic tech corporations, gain incredible, unchecked power, but completely stop solving the real-world miseries of the people they are supposed to serve, are they unconsciously freezing their own rivers? By ignoring the people on the ground, are they simply opening their own gates to the next inevitable conqueror?